You know, life has a way of humbling you in places you least expect. I spent my whole life working, saving, sacrificing just to build a home. That house wasn't just bricks and walls. It was my blood, my story, my family's security. And yet one day, standing in the living room of the very house I built, I heard words that cut me deeper than any knife. Pay the rent or get out. Not from a stranger, not from a landlord, but from my own daughter-in-law. Imagine that for a moment, being told to pay rent in the home you already paid for, the home you raised your children in. My son stood silent. The walls felt like they were closing in. And in that moment, I realized something every father learns. Too late respect can be lost in a single sentence. But what they didn't know is that I wasn't broken. I wasn't beaten. A week later, I made a decision they never saw coming, and it changed the future of this family forever. Stay with me, because once you hear what happened after I sold that house, you'll never look at family the same way again. Before I begin, I want to thank Father's Wise Advice for giving me this platform to share my story. This isn't just about me, it's about every father who has sacrificed for family and every lesson we leave behind for those who will come after us. As you listen, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments whether you're from Houston, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, Los Angeles, California, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, or a small town anywhere across America. Let me know, because family stories like this one connect us all. I want you to picture this with me. A house standing proud on the corner of a quiet street. Not the biggest house in town, not the fanciest, but every inch of it built on sacrifice. That was my house. 40 years of labor, 40 years of missed vacations, 40 years of sunburnt mornings and late nights when I stumbled through the front door too tired to eat dinner. I didn't have wealth passed down to me. I didn't have inheritance money waiting in a bank. What I had was calloused hands, a stubborn will, and a promise I made to myself as a young man that my children would never grow up wondering if they belonged. I wanted them to have a roof that could not be taken from them, a place that felt safe no matter how cruel the world outside might be. That house became more than walls and wood. It was a dream I carried inside me long before I could afford it. I remember sitting at the kitchen table of our old rented apartment with my wife, back when she was still alive, sketching floor plans on napkins. We used to whisper about paint colors and garden beds, as if speaking those little details out loud would one day summon them into reality. When the day finally came, when I signed those first mortgage papers, I felt taller walking out of that bank. It wasn't just debt. It was proof that I was building something that could stand longer than I ever would. The years in that house tell the story of my life. I can still hear the echo of little footsteps pounding across that hallway when my boy was just a child. I can smell the Sunday dinners my wife cooked: fried chicken, cornbread, collard greens, the aroma filling the room so thick you couldn't walk in without smiling. That dining table, scratched and stained with the years, held birthday cakes, Christmas hams, and more arguments and reconciliations than I could ever count. I watched my son take his first steps in that living room. I patched up scraped knees in that kitchen. I sat on the porch during summer evenings, rocking slow, listening to crickets sing as the house lights glowed behind me. That home wasn't a property. It wasn't an asset. It was a timeline of everything I had given as a father. I can't count the sacrifices that went into keeping those walls standing, the overtime shifts, the nights I drove an old truck through icy roads just to put in a few more hours, the weeks when I went without buying myself new shoes so I could pay the mortgage on time, and I never complained, not once, because every nail I hammered, every bill I paid, every ounce of sweat that fell onto that ground was for one reason only: so my family would never question whether they had a place in this world. And as the years rolled forward, that house became my anchor. When my wife passed, it was the one place that still smelled like her perfume, still echoed with her laughter, still carried her presence in the corners no one else noticed. When I was lonely, I'd sit in her old chair, close my eyes, and swear I could feel her hand resting over mine. To me, that house wasn't just mine. It was ours. A monument of love, labor, and legacy. But here's the truth I never wanted to face. The truth that makes this story worth telling. No matter how much heart you pour into something, no matter how deep the roots you lay, it only takes one moment, one voice, one decision to shake it all. And for me, that moment came not from an enemy, not from a stranger, but from inside my own family. The very people I built the house for would one day stand in it and treat me like I was an outsider. But before we get to that, I need you to understand. This wasn't just a house. It was my life story, written in wood, brick, and sacrifice. And that's what makes what happened next so painful and so unforgettable. I still remember the first time I met her, my daughter-in-law. She walked into my house with a smile that seemed polite enough, maybe even warm. I shook her hand, looked into her eyes, and told myself, if she makes my son happy, that's all that matters. That's the thing about being a father. You spend so much of your life protecting your children. But once they grow up, you realize the hardest part isn't letting them go into the world. The hardest part is watching who the world brings back into their lives. At first, I tried to welcome her in the way my wife would have wanted me to. I pulled out the old photo albums, told stories about how my son used to run barefoot through the yard, and even laughed when she teased him about his boyish grin. I wanted her to feel at home. This house wasn't just mine anymore. It was supposed to be theirs too. A place where new memories could be layered over the old ones. But slowly, little things began to shift. Nothing sharp, nothing obvious. It started with her voice cutting across family dinners, making small corrections, subtle digs, tiny reminders that this was their home now, not mine. At first, I brushed it off, told myself, she's young, she's adjusting, give it time. The Breasters, the summary of breasted. But you can feel it, can't you? When the air in your own home doesn't carry your name anymore, when your presence feels less like comfort and more like intrusion. That's how it began. The evenings changed. Where my son used to sit with me on the porch and talk about his day, he now hurried off to the back room with her, door shut, laughter muffled, as if I were some neighbor overstaying my welcome. The living room, once filled with family photos and little tokens of our past, slowly became a showroom for things I didn't recognize. The curtains came down, the furniture was rearranged, and every change felt like another corner of my history being erased. I told myself not to complain. After all, wasn't this what fathers work for? To see their children stand on their own? To let them build their lives inside the shelter you created? So, I stayed quiet. I smiled when she brought home new decorations, even when the old ones disappeared into boxes I never saw again. But here's the part that weighed on me the most, my son. I kept searching his face for the boy I once knew. The one who used to run to me with scraped knees. The one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after a long day. Now he stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes lowered, as if loyalty had become a choice he didn't know how to make. I could feel the distance growing. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't obvious, but it was there in the silence. She didn't need to raise her voice for me to understand I was no longer the center of this home. I was an old man in the corner, tolerated out of obligation, not embraced out of love. And yet, I held on. I held on because this house wasn't just four walls, it was a promise. And promises aren't meant to be broken just because life gets uncomfortable. Still, deep inside, I knew. Something was coming. Something sharp. Something that would tear open the fragile peace we had. Because disrespect rarely comes all at once, it builds, slow and steady, until one day it explodes in a moment you can never take back. And in my story, that explosion came the night she raised her voice in my living room and said the words no father should ever hear in the home he built with his own two hands. It was a Tuesday night. Nothing special about it. Nothing that warned me. My life was about to shift. I had just come back from the store, carrying a bag of groceries, milk, bread, and a few things I thought might make dinner easier. Old habits die hard, you know. Even after years of cooking for myself, I still found myself buying enough for a family, thinking of my son and her as I walked the aisles. When I stepped through the front door, I could feel it. The air wasn't warm, it wasn't welcoming. It was thick, heavy, almost waiting for something to crack open. I placed the bag on the kitchen counter, glanced toward the living room, and there they were, my son and his wife, standing close, whispering just loud enough to remind me I wasn't part of the conversation. I cleared my throat and said, "I picked up some things for dinner if you're hungry." She turned her head, and the look in her eyes wasn't gratitude, it was fire. That's when it happened. Her voice, sharp and cutting, sliced across the room. "You need to pay the rent or get out!" The words hit me like a slap I never saw coming. For a moment, I didn't even process them. My ears rang, and I just stood there, my hand still clutching the grocery bag as if I could hold myself steady with a loaf of bread. Pay the rent? In the home I had sacrificed everything to build? In the same house where I held my newborn son? Where I buried my wife's tears into my shoulder? Where every wall carried a piece of me? I looked at my son. God knows I searched his face for something, for a defense, for a correction, for a shred of loyalty, but all I saw was silence. His head lowered, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed anywhere but mine. He didn't speak, he didn't move. And that silence screamed louder than her words. My chest tightened, not from anger, but from heartbreak. I wanted to tell her about the years I worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. I wanted to remind her that the only reason her husband had a roof over his head was because I never let mine rest. I wanted to shout that this wasn't a house to rent, it was a legacy already paid for in sweat and sacrifice. But I didn't. Instead, I felt the weight of every year press down on me. I set the grocery bag on the counter, slowly, carefully, like a man carrying something fragile, and I stood there in silence. Her words hung in the room like smoke. She didn't take them back. She didn't soften them. She meant them. And my son's silence? That was the knife that twisted deeper than anything she could have said. I looked around the living room, and suddenly it didn't feel like mine anymore. The curtains she picked out, the furniture I didn't recognize, the coldness in the air. For the first time, I realized I was no longer at home. I was a guest, unwanted, tolerated only until I followed her command. That was the breaking point. It wasn't just her voice. It was the shattering of everything I thought family was supposed to be. It was the moment I understood that respect can vanish and loyalty can stay silent. I walked to my room that night without a word, closed the door, sat on the edge of that bed and stared at the floor. My hands were still trembling, not from rage, but from the ache of being reduced to nothing in my own home. The words, "pay the rent" or "get out," circled in my head over and over, but the silence that followed them, that was the part that wouldn't leave me. I tried to listen for my son's footsteps. I hoped he might knock on my door, come in, sit down and say, "Dad, I'm sorry." She didn't mean it that way. Don't take it to heart. But the knock never came. Instead, I heard them moving around the kitchen. The soft shuffle of their slippers, the opening and closing of cabinets, a laugh that didn't belong in that moment. I thought about all the nights I had sat at that same table with my wife, laughing about nothing, whispering about bills, planning for birthdays. And now, on this night, my son and his wife were in that same kitchen, and I was on the other side of the wall, alone. I reached over to the nightstand and picked up a photograph. Me, my wife, and my son, when he was no older than 8. His hair messy, his smile wide, his little arm thrown around my neck like I was his whole world. My wife's face glowed with joy. And mine, I looked younger, stronger, filled with a pride that I thought could never be broken. I stared at that photo until my eyes blurred, and I whispered, almost without realizing it, "What happened to us?" The hours passed slowly. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind kept going back to the same truth: I was a stranger in the home I built. I wasn't wanted, not by her, and worse, not defended by him. Around midnight, I heard the TV flick on in the living room. I could hear faint voices from a sitcom, the kind of laughter track that makes you realize how hollow real laughter can sound when you're broken inside. They were together on the couch. I was alone behind a closed door. I could have walked out. I could have demanded respect. But instead, I stayed quiet, because sometimes silence says more than any shouting ever could. That night, I understood something about family I'd never wanted to learn. Love can be unconditional, But respect is fragile. It has to be nurtured, honored, returned, and when it's not, it dies quietly, without ceremony, leaving only silence behind. When morning finally came, I walked out to the kitchen. My son was sitting there sipping coffee, his eyes fixed on his phone. He glanced up at me, but not for long. He didn't speak. He didn't ask how I slept. He didn't even acknowledge the storm we had just lived through. And she moved around the kitchen like nothing had happened, humming, pouring herself a glass of juice, flipping through the mail, as if those words she threw at me had vanished into thin air. That silence, that deliberate ignoring of what had happened, was worse than the shouting. Because shouting means there's still something to fight for. But silence means they've already closed the door on you in their hearts. I sat down at the table across from my son, and I looked at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. And in that moment, I knew, whatever bond we once had, whatever thread tied us together as father and son, it was fraying. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't try to explain myself. Instead, I folded my hands, bowed my head, and made peace with a truth no father wants to accept. Sometimes, the family you gave everything for forgets the cost of what you built. And in that silence, in that heavy, suffocating quiet, a seed was planted inside me. A seed that grew into resolve, because if they were going to treat me like a tenant, then I would remind them who the real owner was, not through anger, not through shouting, but through a choice they would never forget. That choice was selling the house. After that night, I found myself moving slower around the house, as if every step carried the weight of something I didn't want to admit. It's strange how quickly a home can change its meaning. The same walls that once echoed with laughter now felt like strangers pressing in on me. I spent more time in my room, not because I wanted to hide, but because it felt safer there, like it was the last place in the house that still belonged to me. I'd sit in the chair by the window, looking out at the yard I had mowed for decades, the fence I had painted with my son when he was just a boy. Those memories would come back uninvited, like guests I didn't know how to turn away. And in that stillness, I asked myself questions no father ever wants to face. Did I fail him? Did I raise him too soft? Did I give too much without teaching him the value of it? Or did I fail by loving too hard? By protecting too much? By never letting him struggle the way I did? Because here's the truth, I never wanted my son to know the hunger I knew as a boy. I never wanted him to feel the shame of wearing worn-out shoes to school or standing in line for hand-me-downs. I wanted his path to be smoother, his nights to be easier, his shoulders lighter, and maybe in shielding him, I forgot that respect is born not out of comfort, but out of appreciation. I thought about my wife. God, how I wished she were there. She had a way of softening things, of bridging gaps I didn't even see. I could almost hear her voice in my head. Don't be so hard on him. Give him time. He'll come around. But the echo of her comfort couldn't cover the sting of what I had heard. When you're an old man, reflection comes with sharp edges. You see your life in pieces, moments you're proud of, moments you regret, choices you'd give anything to take back. And as I sat there, I realized this was one of those moments that would stay with me forever, no matter what I did next. I remembered the day I first carried my son into that house, wrapped in a blue blanket small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. I remembered thinking, this is why I built this place. So he will always have somewhere safe, somewhere he belongs. And now, decades later, he stood beside a woman who told me I didn't belong at all. The weight of that irony nearly crushed me. But here's where the reflection turned. As I sat there, staring at the photo frames lined up on my dresser, I felt something shift. It wasn't anger. Anger burns hot and fast. This was quieter, deeper. It was dignity. I told myself, if they see me as a burden, I won't argue. If they think I need to earn my right to stay, I won't beg. I won't let my final years be spent fighting for scraps of respect in the very house I built. That was the moment the decision began to take root inside me. Not as revenge, not as bitterness, but as a choice every man has to make at some point in his life to walk away with his head held high, even if it means leaving behind everything he poured his soul into. And yet, even as that thought hardened in me, I felt tears sting my eyes, because no father ever dreams of teaching his son a lesson this way. No father ever wants to stand at the crossroads between legacy and love, knowing that whichever path he chooses, something will be lost forever. But deep down, I knew. The silence in that house, the coldness in those rooms, the absence of gratitude, it wasn't just a passing storm. It was the new reality, and if I didn't act, I'd wither away in the very place I had built to give me life. So I sat back in that chair, staring out at the yard as the sun dipped low. And I whispered to myself, the way men sometimes do when no one's around to hear, it's time. Time to stop clinging to what once was. Time to take back the dignity that was slipping from me. Time to make the kind of choice that doesn't just end a chapter, but rewrites the book entirely. And with that reflection, the plan began forming quietly in my heart. A plan they never saw coming. Betrayal doesn't always come in the form of loud words or slammed doors. Sometimes, it hides inside silence. And silence, when it comes from the person you love most, can cut sharper than any insult. What haunted me most in those days wasn't just what my daughter-in-law had said, it was what my son didn't say. He didn't step in. He didn't place a hand on my shoulder. He didn't remind her that this house was mine, that it was built by my sacrifices long before she ever knew our family. No. He just stood there, lips pressed tight, letting her words hang in the air, like they carried truth. Every time I replayed that moment, it struck me harder. I could almost forgive her. She didn't know the weight of what I carried, the nights of hunger I endured as a boy, the way I clawed my way into ownership of this house, brick by brick. But my son? He knew. He had lived it with me. He had seen me come home covered in dirt and sweat, exhausted but still smiling as I lifted him into my arms. He had felt the warmth of the home I built, the security of never having to wonder where he'd sleep. And yet, when the time came to defend me, he chose silence. That silence became a shadow in the house. Every time we crossed paths in the hallway, in the kitchen, even sitting across from each other at the table, I could feel it. The space between us had changed. His eyes avoided mine, and when they did meet, they carried something distant, almost shame, but not enough to move him toward apology. There is no weight heavier for a father than realizing the child he raised has chosen someone else's voice over his. It's not jealousy. It's not anger. It's the heartbreak of knowing your place in his heart has shifted, that the bond you thought was unshakable can, in fact, be bent by pressure, by influence, by convenience. I carried that weight like a stone pressed into my chest. At night, lying in bed, I could hear my own breathing echo against the silence, and every breath reminded me of the loneliness that had crept into the house. This place, once filled with laughter and the sound of my wife's voice, now felt like a courtroom where I was judged in silence and found guilty of overstaying my welcome. Sometimes I wanted to ask him directly, "Son, do you really believe I owe rent in the house I gave you?" But the words never left my lips, not because I was afraid of his answer, but because I already knew it. His silence had said it all. I began to notice small changes in myself. I no longer lingered in the living room. I no longer sat at the table hoping for conversation. I ate quickly, washed my plate, and returned to my room. That house, the one I thought would shelter me in my final years, was slowly pushing me into a corner. And the hardest part? I could still see glimpses of my little boy in him. The boy who once called me his hero, who ran to me after school with stories about his day, who clung to my hand during thunderstorms. That boy was still in there somewhere, but I couldn't reach him. He had been buried under pride, under marriage, under the kind of pressure I never wanted him to carry. It hurt me in a way I can't fully explain because fathers don't raise children expecting perfection. We raise them hoping they'll remember the sacrifices, hoping they'll carry the lessons of gratitude and respect into their own families. When they forget, it feels like a betrayal of not just love, but of life itself. That's what weighed on me in those days. Not her words, but his silence. Not the disrespect of a daughter-in-law, but the absence of loyalty from my son. I carried that betrayal quietly, but it hardened me. It didn't make me bitter, but it made me resolute, because I realized then that love without respect is a cage. And I wasn't going to let the rest of my days be lived inside that cage. So I began to form a plan born out of heartbreak, but guided by dignity, a plan that would show them both, not through arguments, not through shouts, but through action, that this old man still had a voice, and that voice would be heard the day I signed away the house. Night is supposed to bring rest, but in those days, night only brought me reminders. The house would settle into quiet. The lights dimmed, and instead of peace, I felt the weight of thoughts pressing down heavier than any blanket. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the lines of plaster that I had patched myself years ago. Funny, the things your eyes cling to when you can't close them. That ceiling had seen me through storms, leaks, and repairs. It had heard my wife's whispers when we lay awake talking about the future. It had watched over my son's childhood, the years when he'd run into our room after a nightmare, curling up between us until sleep reclaimed him. Now, it just stared back at me while I wrestled with questions I couldn't silence. How did it come to this? How did my son, the boy who once looked at me like I was the strongest man alive, let me be spoken to like a stranger? Where did I lose him? I'd turn onto my side, close my eyes, try to breathe deep, but the silence of the house was too sharp. I could hear the faint hum of their laughter from the living room. Not loud, just enough to remind me I wasn't part of it. They had carved out a world for themselves, and in their world, I was an intruder. I thought about leaving right then, in the middle of the night, packing a bag, walking out, never looking back. But my pride, my love for the home I had built, kept me rooted to that bed. I told myself, you don't walk away in the night like a thief. If you go, you'll go on your terms, with your dignity intact. Hours slipped by. I sat up, walked to the window, and looked out over the yard bathed in pale moonlight. That yard once held a swing set I built from spare lumber, just so my boy could feel the thrill of flying through the air on summer afternoons. I could almost hear the creak of the chains, the squeal of his laughter. That memory struck me hard. I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered, "Where did we go wrong, son?" The night dragged on, and with every hour, the weight of betrayal pressed harder. I remembered working night shifts at the factory, my hands blistered, my eyes burning, but always reminding myself it was worth it because my family would never go without. Now here I was, wide awake in the house those sacrifices built, feeling like a guest overstaying his welcome. Toward dawn, I finally sat at the edge of my bed, my body exhausted but my mind sharp as a blade. That's when it hit me. Sleep wasn't coming because rest can't exist where there's no peace, and peace was gone from this house. The decision started to take shape in those sleepless hours. Not a decision born out of rage, but out of clarity. If my presence here brought tension, if my sacrifices were no longer remembered, then maybe the final lesson I had left to give was this: never mistake silence for weakness. The sun began to rise, casting light over the same walls I had painted with my wife, the same floorboards my son once played on with his toy cars. I stood up, stretched my stiff back, and whispered to the empty room, "If I can't rest in the house I built, then it's no longer mine." That morning I dressed slowly, buttoning my shirt with the calmness of a man carrying a secret. The decision had been made in the shadows of sleepless nights, and soon the light of day would see it carried out. So, one afternoon, I stepped out of the house. The air felt lighter outside than it had in weeks. I walked slowly down the street, past the same neighbors who had seen me mow that lawn for years, past the oak tree that shaded my porch each summer. My feet carried me to the diner on the corner, the one I'd gone to since my younger days. Inside, the place smelled of bacon, grease, and coffee. The same old booths, the same faded photographs on the wall, the same chipped mugs. It was familiar, and right then, I needed familiar more than anything. I slid into a booth across from an old friend of mine, Harold. We'd known each other for decades, two men who had worked long shifts together, raised kids on paychecks that never stretched far enough, and buried our wives too soon. He could read my face before I even said a word. "You've got that look, Sam," he said, sipping his coffee. "The look of a man carrying more than he ought to." I didn't answer right away. I stared at the steam rising from my cup, searching for the right words. Finally, I said quietly, "She told me to pay rent or get out. In my own house." Harold set his mug down slow, his brow furrowed. "Your daughter-in-law?" I nodded. "And your boy?" he asked. "Silent," I replied. That one word carried more weight than I could bear. Harold leaned back, exhaling long and heavy. He didn't rush to speak, and I appreciated that. Real friends don't fill silence with empty words. They let it settle until the truth can rise. "Sam," he finally said, "you've spent your life giving your strength, your years, your very body to build that place. But here's the hard truth. Not everyone values what they didn't have to bleed for. Your boy never saw the hunger you endured. She certainly didn't. To them, that house is just a place to live. To you, it's a monument. That difference will eat you alive if you stay." I felt something shift in my chest. He was speaking aloud the very thoughts I'd wrestled with in silence. "I don't want to abandon him," I admitted. My voice cracked a little. "He's my son, my only boy." Harold nodded. "Of course you don't. No father does. But ask yourself, what lesson are you teaching him by staying quiet, by letting them treat you like a burden? If you stay, he learns it's acceptable. If you go, maybe one day, when he's older, when she's not around, he'll remember what dignity looks like." His words hit me deep, not as advice, but as truth. Fathers don't just raise sons through discipline. We raise them through the way we carry ourselves, even when it hurts. Harold reached across the table and placed a rough hand on mine. "Sometimes, son, letting go isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing a man can do. You can't change their hearts by begging, but you can remind them of who you are by walking away with your head high." We sat there in silence after that, just two old men, coffee cooling in front of us, the weight of years heavy on our shoulders. But for the first time in days, I felt clarity. I left that diner knowing what I had to do. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about teaching her a lesson. It was about preserving the last thing I had left, my dignity. When I stepped back into the house that evening, the tension was still there. Their voices hushed when I entered, the air still sharp with unspoken words. But inside me, something had changed. The sleepless nights had birthed a decision, and Harold's wisdom had sealed it. The house was still mine, legally, spiritually, historically, and soon I would remind them of that truth in the quietest, yet loudest way possible, by selling it. When I walked back into the house after that talk with Harold, nothing had changed on the surface. The same curtain she had hung still covered the windows. The same hum of the television floated down the hallway. My son's shoes were by the door, just as they always were. To anyone else, it was an ordinary evening. But inside me, something had shifted. I didn't slam doors. I didn't demand answers. I didn't throw accusations. Instead, I carried the weight of my decision in silence, letting it sit heavy in my chest like a stone I had chosen to hold. Because when a man finally decides on something that important, there's no need for shouting. The resolve itself speaks loud enough. That night, I sat at the small desk in my room and pulled out a piece of paper. My hands, though a little shaky from age, were steady in purpose. I wrote down the number of a realtor I'd met years ago at church, a woman who had handled properties for a few other men my age when they downsized. Her name was Linda. Reliable, professional, and most of all, discreet. The next morning, I called her. My voice was calm, measured. I told her I was interested in selling the house. She asked if I was sure, and I said yes without hesitation. There was no tremor in my words, no pause. Because the truth is, once you've decided to reclaim your dignity, every hesitation feels like a betrayal to yourself. We scheduled a meeting. I asked her to come quietly, without the signs, without the fuss, just a conversation in the corner of the diner. When we met, she slid paperwork across the table, explaining the steps, the timelines, the signatures required. I listened carefully, nodding, not because I didn't understand, but because I knew what I was setting in motion was bigger than paperwork. Every line I signed was more than ink on a page. It was a statement. It said, "You can take my presence for granted. You can overlook the sacrifices I made, but you will never strip away my dignity." When I returned home, they didn't notice the change in me. My son greeted me with a half-hearted nod, his eyes glued to his phone. She moved around the kitchen with the same clipped footsteps, humming to herself as though the air wasn't thick with unspoken hurt. They had no idea that the very foundation beneath them was already shifting. And here's the thing about quiet decisions. They feel almost sacred. No one else hears them, but you do. You carry them in your bones, and with each passing day, they give you strength. That week, I kept to my routine. I mowed the yard one last time, each stripe of green reminding me of years spent keeping this place alive. I walked through every room, not in sadness, but in reflection. I touched the mantel where family photos once stood. I lingered by the window where my wife used to water her plants. I opened the closets, running my hand along the shelves I had built myself. It wasn't grief I felt, it was closure. A quiet goodbye to the chapters that had been written inside those walls. At night, I still heard their muffled conversations, their laughter, their plans for the future, but I no longer felt crushed by it. Because I knew something they didn't. In a matter of weeks, the house they thought they controlled would no longer be theirs to command, and I wasn't doing it to punish them. No, this decision wasn't born of spite. It was born of self-respect, of knowing that a man cannot live where he is disrespected, of accepting that sometimes the greatest lesson a father can give isn't through words, but through the choices he makes. That was my quiet decision. And once made, it carried me forward with a peace I hadn't felt in years. The house was already sold in my heart, long before the ink dried. The morning I made that call to Linda, the realtor, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, sunlight just beginning to filter through the blinds. For a moment, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the creaks of the old floorboards as the house settled into another day. It struck me then this place had always been alive to me. More than walls, it breathed with memories, with years, with love that had once filled every room. And now I was preparing to let it go. I dialed her number with steady fingers. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm, professional, and familiar. We exchanged small pleasantries before I finally said the words, "Linda, I want to sell my house." She paused. "Are you sure, Sam? That place, it's been your life." "I know," I told her. "But sometimes, holding on too tight makes you lose yourself. I'd rather let go with dignity than stay where I'm no longer respected." Her silence on the other end carried understanding. Then, gently, she asked when I wanted to meet. We agreed on that afternoon, not at the house, but at the diner again. That place had become my sanctuary, neutral ground where I could speak freely, without eyes watching or ears straining from behind doors. When she slid into the booth across from me, she didn't come with a stack of papers right away. She came with compassion. She asked how I was holding up. She looked me in the eye, the way people do when they know the decision isn't just about business, but about heartache. I explained only what needed explaining, that I wasn't being pushed out by money troubles, that I wasn't making this choice lightly. I told her it wasn't about revenge, but about respect. She nodded, her eyes soft, but she didn't press me further. Then came the paperwork. The forms looked ordinary: addresses, signatures, market values, commission rates. But to me, each page was a piece of my past being carefully folded into the future. Every time I pressed my pen to the paper, I felt the weight of what I was doing. I thought about my wife and how she would have sat across from me, steadying my hand, reminding me that dignity matters more than possessions. I thought about my son and how one day he might look back on this and understand, not immediately, maybe not for years, but eventually, that this wasn't an act of anger. It was a lesson. Linda assured me the market was strong, that houses like mine, with character and history, were still sought after. She promised discretion, moving the process forward without the kind of noise that would draw attention too soon. I thanked her for that. I wanted the choice to remain mine until the very last moment. When I left the diner that day, I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel doubt. I felt lighter. Not because I was happy about selling, but because for the first time in weeks, I had taken back control of my life. Walking back into the house, I noticed them in the living room, my son and his wife, their voices low, their laughter soft. They looked up briefly when I entered, then went right back to their conversation. They had no idea that the ground beneath them was already shifting, that the roof over their heads was no longer secured by their silence, but by my decision. I sat quietly at the kitchen table, my coffee cooling in my hands, and thought to myself, the first step has been taken. There's no turning back now. And strange as it may sound, I felt proud. Proud not because I was letting go, but because I was choosing the harder path, the path of dignity. From that day forward, Every interaction in that house felt different. I wasn't just the father ignored in silence. I was a man who had already chosen his next chapter, even if no one else knew it yet. The house was still standing, but in my heart, it had already been sold. The day finally came, sooner than I thought it would. Linda called me early in the morning, her voice steady but gentle. "Sam, the papers are ready. We just need your signature to finalize everything." I sat on the edge of my bed for a long while before moving. The sun was pouring through the blinds, dust floating in the light like tiny reminders of time. This house had seen thousands of mornings like this, but this one felt different. Final. Before leaving, I walked the house one last time, not as an owner, but as a man saying goodbye. I started in the hallway. The marks on the wall were still there, faint pencil lines where I had measured my son's height each year. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the grooves of time. Each line carried a memory. The year he shot up taller than I expected. The year he stood proud because he had grown just enough to be taller than his mother's shoulder. Those lines were more than measurements, they were proof of a childhood lived inside these walls. In the living room, I paused at the mantel. It was bare now, stripped of the family photos I had once displayed, but I could still see them in my mind. My wife holding our son in her arms, her smile brighter than the Christmas tree behind her. Birthdays with crookedly iced cakes, candles glowing. Sunday afternoons when the room filled with voices, laughter, and the smell of food drifting in from the kitchen. I walked into the kitchen next. The same tiles I had laid down myself were cracked in places, worn from decades of footsteps. My wife used to hum while she cooked here. I could almost hear her soft, low, a tune that carried warmth into every corner. I stood there for a long time, letting the memory wash over me, wishing for just one more meal, one more laugh with her across the table. In my son's old bedroom, I opened the closet door and found it empty, but I could still picture the toys that once cluttered those shelves, the sneakers kicked carelessly into corners, the posters he hung on the walls when he was a teenager. I could see him sitting on the bed, telling me about his dreams, his plans, his hopes for the future. A part of me still wished I could step back into those years, hold on to the boy who once thought I hung the moon. Finally, I went to my own room. I sat for a while in the chair by the window, the same spot where I had spent so many nights reflecting, praying, grieving. I whispered to my wife again, as I had so many times before, "I'm letting it go now, love. I hope you'd understand." When the time came, I didn't make a speech. I didn't gather them in the living room. I walked out with the same quiet dignity I had carried since that night. At the closing office, the papers were laid out in front of me. I picked up the pen, my hand steady. Each signature was a goodbye. Not bitter, not angry, just final. The realtor looked at me as if waiting for regret to show in my face, but there was none. Because by then, I had realized something important. The house wasn't my legacy. My legacy was in the lessons I left behind, in the dignity I carried, in the reminder that respect is worth more than four walls. When I left the office, the weight I had carried for weeks felt lighter. I walked out into the sunlight, the sound of traffic humming around me, and I felt strangely free. That afternoon, when I returned home for the very last time, I didn't announce what I had done. They sat in the living room, unaware that the ground beneath them had already shifted. I simply went to my room, packed the few things that mattered, photographs, keepsakes, my Bible, the watch my father left me, and placed them carefully into a bag. I took one last look around, not in sadness, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had stood up for himself in the only way left to him. Then I walked out. The house was no longer mine. And in that moment, I realized it had never been about the house at all. It was about dignity. It was about respect. And it was about teaching a lesson that words could never carry. That was the day of the sale. I didn't pack in a rush. No, I took my time, because every item I touched carried a piece of my story. The process wasn't about filling boxes. It was about deciding what mattered enough to carry with me into this new chapter. I began in my bedroom. The dresser drawers had been with me for decades, heavy oak, worn smooth from years of use. Most of the clothes inside were old, some too worn to wear, others carrying the scent of years gone by. I ran my hand across each folded shirt, remembering where I had been when I wore it. Some I left behind without hesitation, knowing fabric holds no power once its time has passed. But there were a few I couldn't part with. The flannel shirt my wife had bought me on our 20th anniversary, faded now but still holding the warmth of her touch. The jacket I wore to my son's graduation, patched at the elbow but heavy with pride. Those went into the suitcase, folded carefully, as if they were pieces of my very heart. On the nightstand sat a photograph of my wife and me, taken in the early years. She was smiling wide, her arm linked through mine, both of us looking younger than I could now even remember feeling. That photo was the first thing I placed gently into my bag. Right beside it went my Bible, its leather cover soft and worn, pages filled with notes scribbled in the margins over the years, verses underlined during times of loss, prayers written when hope felt far away. That Bible wasn't just a book. It was my companion through every storm. In the drawer, I found the pocket watch my father had left me, its chain tarnished, but still strong. I held it in my palm for a long moment, remembering his words, "Time is all we truly borrow, son. Use it well." That went into the bag too, because leaving the house wasn't the end of my time, it was the beginning of how I would choose to use the days I had left. Next, I walked through the living room. I didn't take furniture or dishes or decorations. Those things could stay. They didn't hold the essence of who I was, but I paused at the mantel. There, tucked in the back, was a small box of keepsakes, my son's first baseball glove, scuffed and stiff from years of use, a few old report cards my wife insisted on keeping, and the birthday cards he had made for us as a child, written in crooked letters with crayons. I picked up one of those cards, the words barely legible. "I love you, Dad." That nearly broke me. But I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled softly, holding it to my chest for a moment before slipping it into the bag. That love may have faded in his adulthood, but I would never let myself forget the boy who once wrote those words. Finally, I walked to the kitchen. The drawers were full of utensils, pots, and pans, most of which had been chosen by my wife decades ago. I stood there for a long time, remembering her humming while she cooked, the sound of the wooden spoon tapping against the pot. I didn't take any of it. Those were tools for a life that had already passed. Instead, I opened the cupboard and took down one coffee mug, her favorite, chipped along the rim but still whole. I placed it gently in the bag, not because I needed another mug, but because it reminded me of mornings when we sat side by side, sipping quietly before the day began. When I finished packing, I looked at what I had chosen: a few clothes, a Bible, a photograph, a watch, a child's glove, a handmade card, and a chipped mug. That was all, a lifetime distilled into a small suitcase and a box. It struck me then we spend our whole lives chasing bigger things, filling houses with furniture, closets with clothes, garages with tools. But in the end, when the time comes to walk away, what we truly carry fits in our hands. Not the house, not the walls, just the pieces of love, memory, and legacy that time can never erase. I zipped the suitcase, lifted it with both hands, and set it by the door. For a moment, I looked around the house one last time. The rooms were quiet. The walls still stood, but it no longer felt like mine. And that was all right, because what mattered most was already with me, packed carefully into that bag, carried not just in my hands, but in my heart. As I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt release, and in that release, I knew I had chosen well. It was late in the evening when my son found out. He came home from work, briefcase in hand, loosening his tie like it was any other day. I was already gone by then. The house looked the same, but it wasn't the same. Papers had already been signed. Ownership had already changed hands. When he noticed my room was empty, I imagine he thought little of it at first. Maybe I had stepped out. Maybe I was at the diner. But as he opened the closet and saw bare hangers, as he looked at the dresser and saw drawers half opened but empty, the truth began to sink in. I wasn't there anymore. And I wasn't coming back. He must have asked his wife first, "Did you know he was leaving?" And I wonder what expression crossed her face. Was it confusion? Was it relief? Or was it the dawning realization that the words she once threw so carelessly had set this entire chain of events in motion? By the time he found the letter I had left on the kitchen table, the house must have felt heavier than ever. It wasn't a long letter, just a few lines in my handwriting. "Son, the house is sold. This was never about money. It was about respect. I raised you in this home so you'd know what sacrifice looks like. Now I leave it so you'll know what dignity looks like. One day, I hope you'll understand." That was all I wrote. Nothing more, nothing less. I imagine he sat at that table for a long while, staring at those words. I know my son well enough to know he didn't break down in tears. He was too proud for that. But pride cannot shield a man from the sting of realizing he stood silent when he should have spoken. The house, which he once assumed would always be there, was now gone. The roof he thought was his security had been swept from under him with the stroke of my pen. He didn't own it. She didn't own it. No, the only man who ever truly owned it had chosen to let it go. I picture him walking through the rooms after reading my letter. The hallway where his childhood height was measured. The kitchen where his mother once stood. The bedroom where his toys once cluttered the floor. But now, those rooms didn't belong to him. They belonged to no one in our family anymore. They belonged to someone else entirely. And that was the shock. Not just that the house was gone, but that I had finally acted without seeking his approval. That the father he thought would endure anything in silence had chosen instead to speak the loudest by walking away. Later that night, I received a call. My phone buzzed on the nightstand in my small new apartment. The walls bare, the furniture simple but clean. I stared at his name glowing on the screen, my son. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to punish him, but because sometimes silence is the only teacher left. For the first time, he would sit in that house, or perhaps outside on the porch, and realize what had been lost: not just a home, but a father's trust, a father's presence, and a father's willingness to endure disrespect. That was his shock. And I knew it would not fade quickly. When my son sat at that kitchen table with my letter in his hands, I imagined the silence between them didn't last long. Silence never survives in a marriage where pride runs hot. She must have snatched that letter from him, her eyes scanning the words. I can picture her face tightening, her lips pressed thin, the disbelief rising like a storm. "He sold it?" she must have hissed. "He actually sold it? The house she thought was hers to command? The walls she rearranged? The curtains she chose? The furniture she moved about without a second thought? All of it had slipped from her hands in a single stroke of my pen. To her, this wasn't just a house. It was power. And now, that power was gone. Her anger must have flared hot. I imagine her voice rising, sharp and cutting, blaming my son. "Why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you say something? You just let this happen?" And my son, already carrying the sting of his silence the night I was humiliated, had no defense. Because deep down, he knew. He knew this wasn't about legal papers or property deeds. This was about respect, the one thing he failed to show when it mattered most. But she wouldn't have cared about that. No, her concern was losing the roof she assumed would always be there. Her anger wasn't born of love or loyalty. It was born of entitlement. She had thrown her words at me like stones, never thinking they would come back to shatter the very ground beneath her feet. I wasn't there to see the full storm, but I didn't need to be. I know human nature. I know the way people react when the thing they thought was secured forever is pulled away. There would have been shouting, accusations, maybe even tears of frustration, not for me, but for the loss of control. And I can only imagine my son sitting there, caught in the crossfire, realizing that the silence he once thought would keep the peace had now set fire to everything instead. What did she expect? That I would roll over, pay rent in the home I built, bow my head, and swallow my pride for the rest of my days? She underestimated me. She underestimated the strength that comes from a lifetime of sacrifice, the resolve of a man who's already weathered storms bigger than her words. Her anger that night was not just about losing a house. It was about realizing she had pushed too far. For the first time, she saw that her words carried consequences, that the old man she dismissed as weak still held the power to change everything. And while she fumed and raged, I sat quietly in my new place, a small apartment with bare walls, but a space filled with peace. No tension in the air, no sharp voices, no silence that stabbed like betrayal. Just me, my memories, and the comfort of knowing I had made the right choice. Meanwhile, in that house, her anger must have burned like wildfire, filling the rooms with heat. But beneath it all, beneath the shouting and blame, there was something else brewing: fear. Fear of a future she could no longer control. fear of what my son might one day see when he finally opened his eyes. Because sooner or later, anger always fades, and when it does, all that's left is truth. And the truth was simple. The house was gone. The power she thought she held was gone. And the father she disrespected had left with his dignity intact, while she was left standing in ashes of her own making. The first morning in my new place felt strange at first. The walls were bare, the floorboards unfamiliar, the air carrying no trace of the life I had once known. But there was something else in that strangeness, something light, something freeing. I woke to the sound of birds outside the window, their chirping sharp against the quiet. No arguments drifting through the walls, no heavy silence pressing on my chest, just stillness. I brewed myself a cup of coffee in that chipped mug I had carried with me, and as the steam rose, I sat by the window and realized this was mine. Every corner of this small apartment belonged to me. Not because of ownership papers, not because of history, but because it was filled only with peace. I took my time unpacking. I placed my wife's photograph on the nightstand, her smile filling the room with warmth. My Bible went beside it, a steady reminder that even in new surroundings, faith remains unchanged. On the dresser, I laid my father's watch, the tick of its hands reminding me that time keeps moving, whether we're ready or not. That afternoon, I walked around the neighborhood. Children were playing on bicycles, their laughter carrying through the air. An elderly woman tended to her garden, offering me a smile as I passed. A man waved from his porch, asking if I was new to the building. I nodded, and he welcomed me with a friendliness I hadn't felt in years. It struck me then, respect isn't always found in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the simple way strangers acknowledge your presence. When I returned home, I sat at the small table again and opened my son's old birthday card, the one scrawled in crayons. "I love you, Dad." The letters were shaky, uneven, but honest. I read it slowly, letting the memory of that little boy settle in my heart. Whatever distance had grown between us now, nothing could erase the truth of who he once was. That love had been real. And perhaps, somewhere buried deep, it still was. The days began to fall into a rhythm. I cooked simple meals, read my Bible in the evenings, and walked in the park nearby. Each night, as I laid my head down, I realized I was sleeping soundly again. Not because everything was perfect, but because the air in my room carried no tension, no hidden resentment, only peace. It wasn't easy, though. There were moments when loneliness crept in. Moments when I wished my wife was there to see this new chapter with me, to reassure me that I had chosen well. There were nights I longed for my son's voice, the sound of him calling me Dad with the tenderness of years long gone. But loneliness is easier to carry when it's honest, when it doesn't come wrapped in the false comfort of people who see you as a burden. This new chapter wasn't about starting over from scratch. It was about learning to live lighter, about realizing that peace, respect, and dignity mean more than any set of walls. I thought often about my son and his wife. I wondered what they said in the evenings, how they explained the empty room where I used to sleep, how they justified the letter left on the table. Part of me hoped the silence had forced him to reflect. Part of me knew she would rage for a while, turning blame into fire. But beneath it all, I trusted that someday he would understand. And maybe that's what this new chapter was truly about, not just freedom for me, but a lesson for him. A lesson he could only learn after feeling the loss, after realizing that respect, once broken, can't be patched back together with silence. As I closed my eyes each night, I whispered a quiet prayer, not for the house I left, not for the anger behind me, but for my son, that one day he would see his father's choice not as abandonment, but as love. A hard love. A painful love, but a love that refused to stay silent in the face of disrespect. Because starting fresh at my age wasn't just about me. It was about leaving behind a final lesson. And in this new chapter, I had found my peace. Now it was his turn to find his understanding. Late at night, when the world quiets and the noise of the day slips away, I often find myself asking the kind of questions only age makes you brave enough to face. What do we really leave behind when we're gone? Is it the house, the land, the possessions we worked so hard to hold on to? Or is it something far less tangible, yet far more enduring? As I sat in my new apartment, surrounded by just a handful of carefully chosen belongings, I realized the truth. A father's real legacy is not in the walls he builds, but in the values he plants. Bricks crumble, paint fades, furniture breaks. But the lessons live on, long after the house is gone. I thought about my own father. He never had much to his name, no property, no savings worth speaking of. But what he gave me was something richer than any bank account. He gave me grit. He gave me faith. He gave me an understanding that dignity must never be sold, not for money, not for approval, not even for family. That was his legacy. And now, all these years later, I understood I was carrying that same torch, passing it forward in my own way. I thought about my wife. Her legacy wasn't in the meals she cooked or the curtains she sewed. It was in the way she treated people, the way she reminded me to temper my strength with gentleness. She taught our son compassion by showing it to neighbors, by lending a listening ear when someone was hurting, by putting love into the small things that others might have overlooked. That was her gift to the world. And then I thought about my son. My heart ached for him, because legacy is only received when the heart is open to it. I had built a house, worked myself to the bone, and tried to give him everything I never had. But along the way, perhaps I shielded him so much that he forgot what those sacrifices cost. Perhaps I gave too freely, and he mistook what was priceless for something ordinary. But even that, I realized, is part of a father's legacy, not just the successes, but the failures too. The mistakes we make become lessons if our children are willing to see them. So what was my legacy now? It wasn't the deed to a house. It wasn't the money from the sale. It was the decision I made to walk away rather than allow myself to be disrespected. It was showing my son that a man's worth is not tied to possessions, but to the way he carries himself when everything else is stripped away. That was what I hoped he would one day understand, that respect is not negotiable. That silence in the face of disrespect is a betrayal of self. And if nothing else, he would remember that his father refused to live, bowed in his own home. As I sat there, I realized something even greater. Legacy doesn't just pass downward to children. It moves outward, to anyone who listens, to anyone willing to hear a story and take it to heart. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every father who ever felt overlooked, every mother who ever gave and wasn't thanked, every grandparent who sat quietly in a room while younger voices grew careless. We all leave something behind. The question is, will it be resentment or will it be dignity? Will it be bitterness or will it be love? That night, I bowed my head and prayed that when my time was done, my son wouldn't just remember the house I sold. I prayed he would remember the man who built it, the man who gave it up, and the man who stood firm in the belief that respect is the true foundation of every family. Because houses come and go, money comes and goes, but a father's legacy that lives forever in the hearts it touches. Respect, that word has been turning over in my mind more than any other. When you reach my age, you begin to understand that respect is not just courtesy. It is the foundation on which every family stands. Love is powerful, yes, but love without respect is fragile. Love can be shouted in words, written in cards, acted out in grand gestures. But if respect is missing, that love is hollow. Respect is what steadies love when storms come. Respect is what makes love trustworthy. I gave my son love from the moment he was born. I gave him shelter, food, guidance, discipline, and sacrifice. But respect was not something I could hand to him like a gift. It was something he had to return freely, a recognition of what it took to raise him, a reflection of the values I tried to plant in him. And when that respect was absent, everything else, even the love I knew he carried somewhere deep, felt diminished. That night when my daughter-in-law shouted those words at me, "Pay the rent or get out," I could have endured them. Words from her alone would have stung, but they would not have broken me. What broke me was my son's silence. Because in that silence, I heard more than words. I heard that respect for his father had been pushed aside, replaced by fear of conflict or the desire to keep peace with his wife. And that is when it struck me. A man can survive without wealth, without comfort, even without constant praise. But he cannot survive without respect from those he gave his life for. Without it, he becomes invisible in his own home, a shadow sitting quietly in the corner while others speak over him. I thought back to my own father. He was not a man of many words, but he commanded respect because of the way he carried himself. I didn't always agree with him. At times, I even resented his strictness. But I never disrespected him, not once. Because even as a boy, I knew the roof above me existed because of him. The clothes on my back, the food on the table, they were there because he sacrificed for me. Respect was not negotiable. It was the air we breathed. That's what I wanted for my son, to grow into a man who not only understood respect but lived it, passed it down to his own family. And yet, here I was, standing in the wreckage of silence, realizing that somewhere along the way, the meaning had been lost. But here's what time has taught me. Respect doesn't always return when you ask for it. Sometimes it only returns when you demand it through your actions. That's why I sold the house. Not because I no longer loved my son, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I could not sit quietly and let disrespect become the currency of my final years. By leaving, I wasn't abandoning him. I was showing them both, that respect must be honored if love is to survive. Without respect, love is a house built on sand. With it, love becomes a foundation that cannot be shaken. I have no doubt my son loves me, in his way. But one day, when the noise of youth fades, when pride quiets, he will remember that his father walked away, not to punish him, but to preserve the dignity that comes with respect. And maybe then, he will teach his own children what I always wanted him to know. Respect is not optional. It is the soil from which every family grows. Without it, nothing lasts. My story is mine, but the lesson it carries is for every son and every daughter who might be listening. Because one day, you too will face the truth I have lived. The people who raised you are not just parents. They are human beings, fragile, flawed, but filled with sacrifice you may never fully see. To the sons, I say this: your father may not have been perfect. He may have been hard at times, quiet at others, unsure of how to show affection in the way you wanted. But look deeper. Look at the shoes he wore until they were worn through so you could have new ones. Look at the long hours he worked, the tiredness in his eyes at night, the way he sat silently at the table, carrying burdens he never spoke of just to keep food on your plate. Respect him. Even if you disagree with him, even if you see the cracks in him, respect the man who laid the foundation of your life. Because one day, when he is gone, you will understand that respect was the truest form of love you could have given back. To the daughters, I say your mother's sacrifices often hide in plain sight. You may remember her scolding, her endless rules, her constant concern. But think of the nights she stayed awake while you were sick, the meals she cooked when she was too tired to stand, the way she put her dreams on hold so you could chase yours. Respect her. Respect her, even when she frustrates you, even when you feel she doesn't understand. Because her life, in so many ways, has been poured into yours. And to all the sons and daughters-in-law, when you marry into a family, you are stepping into a story that began long before you arrived. Honor it. You may not agree with every tradition, every choice, every habit, but remember this: the walls you live under were built by hands that worked before you ever knew their name. Don't tear down with your words what took a lifetime of sacrifice to build. Respect is not about agreement. It is not about blind obedience. It is about recognition. Recognition of what came before you, recognition of the cost that allowed you to stand where you stand today. I wish I could have told my son this lesson before it was too late, before the silence between us became too heavy to cross. But maybe this story is the way it will reach him and reach others too. Because at the end of the day, my house is gone. The walls are sold. The rooms no longer echo with my footsteps, but the lesson remains. To every son and daughter who still has a parent living, call them, sit with them. Listen to their stories. Even if you think you've heard them 100 times, listen again, because one day, you'll give anything to hear them once more. Respect costs nothing, but its absence costs everything. Don't let silence take the place of gratitude. Don't let pride steal from you the chance to honor the very people who carried you when you couldn't walk on your own. That is my lesson. Not from a perfect father, not from a flawless man, but from a man who gave everything he had for his family and learned, in the end, that respect is the only inheritance worth fighting for. As I sit here now, Far from the house I built and sold, I no longer carry the weight of anger. My story isn't about revenge. It isn't about punishing my son or his wife. No, it is about a truth that time has carved into me. Dignity is worth more than comfort, and respect is worth more than walls. I don't regret what I did. If anything, I regret waiting so long to do it. I spent nights hoping things would change, waiting for words that never came, for an apology that was never offered, for a recognition that never arrived. But when you're old, you realize waiting is dangerous. It can turn into wasting. And I refused to waste the rest of my days sitting in a house where my very presence was treated as a burden. So I left. And in leaving, I discovered something I had forgotten. Freedom. Not the kind that comes with money or travel or luxury, but the kind that comes from being at peace with yourself. Sometimes, people will not see your worth until you're no longer there to give. Sometimes, the lessons you long to teach won't be learned in your presence, but in your absence. And though it broke my heart to walk away, I trust that one day, when the noise of life grows quiet for my son, he will think back on what happened and understand. He will remember that his father refused to be silenced, refused to be treated as less than he was. And maybe then, he'll teach his own children differently. Life is not measured in the houses we own or the things we collect. It is measured in the values we leave behind, the way we walk when tested, the dignity we hold even when disrespected. That is what endures. That is what matters. So if you hear anything in my story, hear this. Never let anyone, not even those you love most, convince you that your worth is negotiable. Carry yourself with dignity, even when it costs you comfort. And honor those who gave their all for you, because respect is the soil that keeps love alive. As I close this chapter of my life, I want to speak directly to you who are listening right now. Maybe you're a son, a daughter, a father, or a grandmother. Maybe you're sitting in Houston, Texas, or Chicago, Illinois. Maybe you're tuning in from Los Angeles, California, or Orlando, Florida, or some small town in the Midwest. Wherever you are, ask yourself this. Have you shown respect to the people who built the foundation under your feet? Because one day, when they are gone, you will not remember the arguments. You will not remember the disagreements. You will remember whether or not you honored them while you had the chance. That is my final wisdom, and I pray you carry it with you. Respect is the truest inheritance you will ever receive, and the greatest gift you can ever give back. My friends, thank you for walking with me through this story. It wasn't easy to tell, but sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that need to be heard the most. Now I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, what does respect mean in your family? Have you ever faced a moment where love wasn't enough without respect? Your stories matter, because they remind us that none of us walk this road alone. And please, let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing the places this community reaches, whether you're sitting in Houston, Texas, Los Angeles, California, Chicago, Illinois, New York City, Orlando, Florida, Phoenix, Arizona, or a quiet town tucked away somewhere in this great country. Write it down below, because each of us comes from different corners, but these lessons of respect and dignity connect us all. This is Father's Wise Advice, and I thank you for allowing me to share a piece of my life with you. Until next time, remember this: houses fade, possessions break, but dignity and respect, those are the foundations that will last for generations.